What if one of the greatest science fiction series ever made almost never happened at all? Star Trek. The Next Generation premiered in 1987 and went on to redefine not just science fiction television, but the very idea of what a weekly drama series could accomplish. It tackled philosophy, morality, identity, and humanity's deepest contradictions, all while making the cosmos feel like a place worth reaching for. But behind the polished corridors of the Enterprise, the real story was far messier, far more human, and far more fascinating than anything that appeared on screen. Creative battles erupted between writers and producers. Actors endured physical pain just to look the part. Beloved characters were written out and brought back through audience pressure alone. And some of the show's most celebrated moments were born not from careful planning, but from chaos, financial desperation, and last-minute instinct. These are 25 secrets hidden for decades behind one of television's most beloved series. And the first one begins with a gamble so bold it could have ended everything before a single episode ever reached your screen. In 1987, Paramount made a decision that raised eyebrows across the entire entertainment industry. Rather than taking the new Star Trek series to a major broadcast network, the studio chose to distribute it directly to local television stations through a model called first-run syndication. There was no safety net, no guaranteed national broadcast slot, and no network infrastructure to catch the show if it stumbled. The survival of the entire production depended on individual markets across the country choosing to pick it up, keep it, and grow it. Failure in enough cities could have ended the experiment mid-season. The stakes were enormous, and the skeptics were plentiful. What made the gamble ultimately pay off, however, was the creative freedom it quietly unlocked. Freed from the interference that came with network oversight, the producers had far greater control over storytelling, tone, and pacing than a conventional series arrangement would ever have allowed. The success of the model didn't just save the show. It helped rewrite the rules of television distribution entirely and opened the door for an era of ambitious syndicated programming that others would rush to imitate. It was a revolution disguised as a risk, and it changed the landscape of the medium in ways that are still being felt today. From the very beginning, Gene Roddenberry established a rule that caught many of his writers completely off guard. The new series would not revisit the alien races that had defined the original Star Trek. No Klingon appearing as regular fixtures, no Vulcans at the helm, no Romulans lurking as familiar threats. Rodenberry wanted to push the universe forward rather than lean on the comfort of nostalgia, and he enforced that vision with considerable conviction. For the writing staff, the restriction created genuine creative challenges. Building new alien civilizations from scratch required extensive world building, and not every invention landed with audiences the way the classic species had. The Ferengi, introduced as a potential dominant threat, struggled almost immediately to make the impact Roddenberry had envisioned. The intimidation simply wasn't there, and the problem would eventually reshape the show's entire villain landscape in ways no one had quite anticipated. Gradually, as the series found its footing, the restrictions began to loosen. Klingon returned, Romulans resurfaced, and the show discovered that blending the old with the new was far more powerful than abandoning its roots entirely. The tension between Roddenberry's forward-looking philosophy and the practical demands of weekly storytelling defined much of the show's early creative identity, and the slow relaxation of his rules marked the beginning of the series truly hitting its stride. Few decisions during pre-production proved as quietly fortunate as a last-minute role reversal that reshuffled two of the show's lead characters before filming had even begun. Marina Sirtis had originally auditioned for the role of security chief, a physically demanding and action-oriented position, while Denise Crosby had read for the part of the ship's empathic counselor. After careful consideration, the producers made the decision to swap them entirely. The switch made an immediate and lasting difference. Sirtis brought a warmth and emotional intuition to Counselor Troy that felt completely natural from the first scene, while Crosby's intensity gave Tasha Yar physicality that genuinely suited the demands of a security officer. Had the original casting held, both characters and the entire chemistry of the Enterprise bridge would have felt fundamentally different. The ensemble that audiences came to love across 7 seasons might never have developed in quite the same way. What makes this story particularly striking is how close the show came to a very different version of itself before a single camera had rolled. These kinds of last-minute decisions rarely receive the attention they deserve, but in this case, a simple swap quietly set the tone for one of the most recognizable and beloved ensembles in television history. There is a behind-the-scenes reality about those early seasons that most viewers watching at home never had any reason to consider. The uniforms were genuinely painful to wear. The original Starfleet costumes were constructed from a tight spandex material that looked sleek and authoritative on screen, but created significant physical strain for the actors enduring them through long production days. Patrick Stewart was among those most vocal about the discomfort, with a form-fitting design placing considerable and ongoing pressure on his back across the show's early seasons. Several cast members reportedly pulled and stretched their costumes constantly between takes, simply to find a moment of relief from the constriction. What viewers experienced as futuristic and effortlessly cool, the cast experienced as an ongoing physical challenge that followed them through every single shoot. The production eventually addressed the problem by redesigning the costumes into a more practical two-piece construction that maintained the same visual identity, while giving the actors far greater mobility and genuine comfort. It was a small but meaningful change, and it illustrates something important about the gap between what appears on screen and what it actually costs the people bringing to life every single day. Not every character aboard the Enterprise was born from a writer's room session or a development meeting. One of the series' most beloved recurring figures came to life because of a personal request from one of Hollywood's biggest stars. Whoopi Goldberg reached out to producers directly, expressing her genuine desire to join the show, not for financial reasons, but because Star Trek had sincerely shaped her childhood. Growing up, Goldberg had been profoundly moved by seeing Nichelle Nichols portray Lieutenant Uhura in the original series, one of the first black women on American television depicted not as a servant, but as a skilled and respected officer. That image had stayed with her for decades. When the chance came to be part of that universe, she made sure the producers knew she was interested, and the production responded by building an entirely new character around her presence. The result was Guinan, the quiet and mysterious bartender of 10 Forward, played with a calm authority that made her one of the most compelling presences on the ship. The character was created specifically for Goldberg, and her connection to the franchise ran far deeper than a celebrity cameo. It is a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected and enduring creative decisions come not from inside the writer's room, but from a fan who never forgot what a show meant to them and had the courage to say so out loud. Long before digital effects became the industry standard, the visual team behind the series faced a challenge that seemed almost impossible on paper. They needed to make weekly television look like a Hollywood film, on a television budget, week after week, with no room for the kind of delays a feature production could absorb. The solution was a combination of extraordinary craftsmanship, practical ingenuity, and almost obsessive attention to detail. At the heart of the visual approach were incredibly detailed physical miniatures. The Enterprise D model was built to a scale that allowed camera crews to capture with depth and texture that flat illustrations or early computer graphics simply could not replicate. Lighting teams worked carefully to simulate the cold, infinite quality of deep space, giving every shot a cinematic weight that felt genuinely expensive. The results left viewers accustomed to the visual limitations of television consistently stunned, and critics took notice in ways that went well beyond polite acknowledgement. The production team had created a visual style that punched far above its budget class, raising the bar for what audiences would expect from science fiction television for years to come. Walk onto any Starfleet vessel in the series, and the walls themselves seemed to speak. Rows of colorful panels, geometric displays, and layered technical readouts make the future feel genuinely functional rather than decoratively invented. That visual language didn't emerge by accident. It was a result of deliberate and meticulous design effort developed primarily by scenic arts supervisor Michael Okuda alongside designer Rick Sternbach. Rather than filling screens with flashing lights or random animations, Okuda created a consistent visual grammar of flat, color-coded panels with angular shapes and precise labeling that implied real systems operating behind every interface. It looked like technology that actually worked. What made the design system remarkable was its extraordinary longevity. The aesthetic spread across every subsequent Star Trek series and became so recognizable that it influenced real-world interface design conversations for years afterward. Hospitals, technology companies, and science communicators all drew inspiration from its clean and intuitive approach. A system invented to make fictional computers look believable ended up shaping how people thought about the relationship between human beings and the machines they interact with every single day. One of the more jarring transitions between the show's first and second seasons went largely unexplained to viewers at the time. Dr. Beverly Crusher, the Enterprise's chief medical officer and one of the series' most central characters, was simply gone when the new season began, replaced by a different doctor without much ceremony or explanation. Behind that quiet disappearance was a story that revealed just how turbulent the show's early years truly were. Gates McFadden, who portrayed Dr. Crusher, was dismissed from the series following the first season amid reported creative tensions during production. The character was replaced by Dr. Catherine Pulaski, played by Diana Muldaur, a capable actress who brought a sharp contrarian energy to the role, but never quite connected with audiences the way McFadden had. The fan response was sustained and unmistakable. Letters poured in, and the groundswell of support for McFadden's return became genuinely difficult to ignore. When changes were made to the writing staff ahead of the third season, the door reopened, McFadden came back, and Dr. Crusher quietly resumed her post as though the gap had never existed. It was a rare and instructive case of an audience genuinely influencing a major production decision and receiving exactly the outcome they had pushed for. Behind some of the most memorable storytelling choices in the series was a very human frustration playing out behind the scenes. Security Chief Tasha Yar had been conceived as a strong and capable presence on the bridge, but the reality of the scripts told a different story week after week. The character was given little meaningful material, and the actress portraying her had grown deeply dissatisfied with where things were heading. Denise Crosby made the difficult decision to leave the show, and the writers responded with something genuinely bold for television at the time. Rather than quietly writing the character off-screen, they gave Tasha Yar a sudden, almost brutally unceremonious death, struck down by an alien creature in a way that deliberately offered no heroic last stand and no farewell speech. It was shocking precisely because it felt so random and so final. But the story didn't end there. The writers found ways to bring the character back in forms that enriched the larger narrative rather than cheapening the original exit. A later storyline revealed that an alternate timeline version of Tasha had survived, gone on to have a daughter with a Romulan commander, and that daughter, Sela, became a compelling recurring antagonist in her own right. What had begun as a casting problem became one of the most creatively ambitious character threads the show ever pursued. Every long-running series eventually faces the same creative pressure. How do you keep stories fresh when your setting and your characters are essentially fixed? For the writers of this series, the answer was built directly into the ship itself. The Holodeck, a room capable of generating fully immersive simulated environments, became one of the most powerful narrative tools in the show's history, and its potential was recognized almost immediately. With the Holodeck available, the writers could effectively produce an entirely different genre of episode without ever leaving the Enterprise. A hard-boiled detective story set in a 1940s city, a Sherlock Holmes adventure on fog-covered streets, a Robin Hood-style forest escapade. Each of these felt like a completely different show, while remaining grounded in the world and characters audiences already knew and trusted. What solidified the Holodeck's reputation wasn't just its flexibility, but the quality it consistently produced. Episodes built around its possibilities earned some of the highest praise the series ever received from critics and from the broader television community. And the device gave the writers a creative resource they would return to with enthusiasm again and again across 7 seasons. The creative team behind the series believed they had found their dominant villain before the first season even aired. The Ferengi, defined by greed, cunning, and an almost theatrical obsession with profit, were positioned to become the central threat of the new Star Trek era. What happened instead became one of the most instructive creative misfires in the franchise's history. The problem was tone. A ruthlessly capitalistic alien race had genuine potential on paper as a mirror held up to human society. But on screen, the Ferengi came across as more comedic than threatening. The menace the show desperately needed from its central antagonists never materialized, no matter how the writers framed their appearances. But what emerged from that failure was something far more significant. The search for a genuinely terrifying enemy pushed the creative team toward an idea that would redefine the entire franchise. The Borg, a relentless and emotionless collective that assimilated entire civilizations without negotiation or mercy, filled the void the Ferengi had left wide open. One villain's failure directly created another's greatness, and the show was never quite the same after Borg made their entrance. Not every challenge in science fiction storytelling can be resolved with battle sequence or a technical solution. Some of the biggest questions about what humanity is capable of, what it deserves, what it might yet become, require a different kind of confrontation entirely. The character Q arrived in the very first episode as if the writers already understood this, giving the show a figure who could pose those questions with wit, provocation, and an unsettling smile. Played with electric unpredictability by John Delancey, Q was a member of an omnipotent alien race who took a pointed and personal interest in humanity's potential. His appearances didn't require expensive set pieces or elaborate action sequences. Instead, Q episodes tended to unfold as philosophical debates dressed in dramatic clothing, challenging Picard and the crew to examine their assumptions about progress, morality, and what it truly meant to be human. Delancey brought such a distinctive and irreplaceable energy to the role that Q transcended the boundaries of a recurring guest and became something closer to the show's philosophical conscience, a godlike Irridan who made the series measurably smarter simply by showing up. There are moments in television history that divide everything cleanly into before and after, and the third season finale of the series produced one of them. The episode known as the Best of Both Worlds built steadily toward a conclusion that very few viewers saw coming, and what it delivered left audiences across the country sitting in stunned silence as the credits rolled. Captain Picard, the moral and intellectual anchor of the entire series, was captured by the Borg and transformed against his will into LCARS, a spokesman and instrument of the collective, turned against the very crew he had spent 3 seasons commanding. The final image of LCARS staring into the camera, Picard's face barely recognizable beneath the Borg technology, was genuinely disturbing in a way the show had rarely attempted before. The episode drew some of the highest ratings the series had ever seen, and the unresolved cliffhanger became a cultural conversation that stretched across an entire summer hiatus. It demonstrated something the show's critics had sometimes doubted, that a series built on optimism and philosophical debate could also deliver pure, visceral dramatic tension when it truly chose to. Following the events of that finale, the most logical next creative step seemed obvious to almost everyone on the writing staff. Show the aftermath. Show what it actually costs a person to survive something that devastating. Writer Ronald D. Moore crafted an episode called Family that did exactly that, pulling Picard away from the Enterprise entirely and sending him home to rural France to recover alongside his brother and his past. Gene Roddenberry objected. His vision of the future held that evolved humans didn't carry psychological wounds the way contemporary people did, and an episode devoted entirely to grief and vulnerability felt to him like a retreat from everything Star Trek was supposed to represent. The writing staff pushed back with considerable conviction. They argued that an episode without a single space battle, without a conventional villain, and without a traditional plot structure was precisely what the series needed at that moment. The episode aired and history sided firmly with the writers. Family is now regularly cited as one of the finest hours the show ever produced, a quiet and deeply human story that proved the series was capable of emotional sophistication that went far beyond the reaches of space. Most episodes of the series operated within a carefully maintained tonal framework, optimistic, thoughtful, and ultimately reassuring about humanity's future. A first-season episode called Conspiracy threw that framework out entirely. What it delivered instead was something so viscerally unsettling that it genuinely caught both audiences and broadcasters off guard. The episode built on an earlier story hinting at a shadowy threat infiltrating Starfleet's highest levels. And when the payoff arrived, it came with imagery that pushed well beyond the show's usual boundaries. The climactic scenes were so graphically intense that several broadcasters in the United Kingdom refused to air them without cuts. For a series associated with civilized debate and measured diplomacy, it was a jarring departure. What makes Conspiracy particularly fascinating in hindsight is how thoroughly the show retreated from its own implications afterward. The storyline was never resolved, the threat was never revisited, and the episode remained an isolated anomaly, a reminder that the show was occasionally willing to venture somewhere much darker than its reputation has ever fully suggested. Television production is at its core a financial operation, and even the most creatively ambitious series occasionally collide with the hard limits of a budget. By the end of the second season, The show had overspent significantly enough that the producers faced a stark and uncomfortable choice. The solution they arrived at was an episode called Shades of Grey, and it remains one of the most openly acknowledged creative missteps in the show's entire run. The episode was constructed largely from recycled footage, with Commander Riker experiencing memory-driven hallucinations that conveniently allowed the production to string together clips from previous episodes rather than shoot substantial new material. The cost savings were real. The creative result was something the cast and crew were largely unenthusiastic about even as they made it, and that lack of enthusiasm showed clearly on screen. What Shades of Grey does offer, viewed generously, is an unusually transparent window into the financial realities that shape television storytelling in ways viewers rarely see. Great shows are not made in a vacuum. They are made under pressure and within constraints. And sometimes those constraints produce something that exists purely to solve a problem rather than to tell a story. In the 6th season, the show's respectful relationship with real science was taken to an entirely different level, not through a technical consultation or a background detail, but through the appearance of one of the most recognizable scientific minds of the 20th century. Walking onto the holodeck for a poker game, Stephen Hawking became the only person in the history of the Star Trek franchise to appear on screen playing himself. The scene placed Hawking at a card table alongside holographic recreations of Albert Einstein and Isaac Newton, with Data as the 4th player. Hawking had requested the visit to the set himself, and by all accounts approached the entire experience with genuine enthusiasm, asking to be shown around the bridge, and reportedly delighting in everything he encountered there. Here was a man who had dedicated his life to understanding the actual universe, sitting comfortably inside a fictional vision of humanity's future, treated not as a curiosity, but as a completely natural presence. The quiet pride the show took in that moment said something deeply meaningful about what it had always aspired to be. Long before the first episode of this series aired, there had been another attempt to bring Star Trek back to the screen. In the late 1970s, Paramount had developed Star Trek Phase 2, a planned television series that would have reunited much of the original cast for a new network. That project was ultimately canceled when the success of a certain science fiction film convinced the studio to pursue a feature film instead. But the scripts written for it didn't simply disappear. Several of those unused stories were quietly adapted and repurposed for the new series. The Child, the episode that opened the troubled 2nd season, was one of them, originally written for a character from the abandoned project and reworked to fit Counselor Troy and the new crew. Devil's Due, which aired in the 4th season, similarly traced its origins back to that Phase 2 development period. Both episodes found new life in a context their original writers had never envisioned, and the practice of drawing from that unused archive created an unexpected continuity between two versions of Star Trek that never actually shared the screen. The writers' strike that hit Hollywood in 1988 created disruption across the entire television industry, and for this series, then navigating a particularly unstable 2nd season, the strike created an unusual opening. A relatively unknown writer named Melinda Snodgrass stepped through that opening with script exploring a deceptively simple but philosophically rich question. Did the android Data have the legal rights of a person, or was he simply property, a machine that Starfleet could dismantle and replicate at will? The episode that resulted, The Measure of a Man, framed that question as a formal legal hearing with Picard and Riker forced onto opposite sides of the argument. The writing was precise, the performances were exceptional, and the ideas it raised were genuinely profound. What made the episode's origins particularly remarkable was the institutional chaos surrounding its creation: a strike, a depleted writing staff, and a season that had already accumulated more than its share of problems somehow produced one of the most celebrated hours in the show's history. The chaos didn't diminish the episode. In a very real sense, it made it possible. Behind some of the most familiar names in the Star Trek universe lies a story that has nothing to do with alien linguistics or futuristic invention. The name of the Enterprise's chief engineer, Geordi LaForge, was chosen as a deliberate tribute to a real person. George LaForge was a young fan who had lived with severe physical disability and passed away before the new series began. He had been a devoted follower of the original Star Trek, and Gene Roddenberry's decision to honor him by naming a main character after him was a quiet but deeply meaningful gesture. The character was given a visual prosthetic the visor, that allowed him to see despite being born blind, turning the tribute into something thematically resonant as well. LeVar Burton brought warmth, intelligence, and understated dignity to the role that made Geordi one of the most genuinely beloved figures in the ensemble. That all of it grew from a tribute to one devoted fan is the kind of detail that reminds you how deeply personal this franchise has always been. When CBS embarked on an enormous project of remastering the series in high definition, one episode presented a challenge that required a particularly creative solution, and the key to unlocking it had been sitting in a private home for more than 2 decades. The Measure of Man had originally been produced in a longer cut before being edited down for broadcast. When the remaster team realized a more complete version existed, they needed to identify what had been cut and where the missing elements might be found. CBS's Michael Okuda reached out to writer Melinda Snodgrass, who had held on to a reference VHS copy of the longer version since the episode's original production. The tape itself wasn't used to restore the footage directly, as its visual quality was far too limited for high-definition work. Instead, it functioned as a precise roadmap, allowing the team to identify the missing scenes and locate the corresponding original 35mm film elements needed for the actual restoration. That a personal keepsake held on to by one writer could play a meaningful role in preserving television history decades later is the kind of story that makes archival work feel genuinely extraordinary. Few characters in the series generated as much audience debate as Wesley Crusher, the teenage prodigy whose presence aboard the Enterprise divided viewers almost from the beginning. What is less widely known is how different that character might have looked had the earliest development conversations gone in another direction. Early conceptual discussions explored a teenage character who bore little resemblance to the Wesley Crusher who eventually appeared on screen. Different approaches to age, background, and role were all considered before the concept settled into something workable, and even then the character continued to evolve well into the show's run. Will Wheaton's casting ultimately shaped the character as much as any page of script. His natural earnestness gave Wesley a sincerity that the writing didn't always support, and he navigated the character's more difficult moments with commitment that earned genuine respect from his castmates. The version that made the screen was only one of several the show might have had, and that uncertainty is part of what makes the character's history unexpectedly fascinating. Behind the scenes, the producers had taken the unusual step of putting certain creative expectations in writing, circulating an internal memo that laid out specific guidelines for how romantic and intimate content should be handled throughout the series. The document attempted to navigate a genuine tension between depicting a mature and evolved human society where relationships were treated with honesty and complexity, and upholding the optimistic ideals that sat at the heart of Star Trek's identity. The memo tried to draw a line between the two, encouraging emotional authenticity, while discouraging content that might feel exploitative or gratuitous. The balance it sought was delicate, and not everyone on the writing staff agreed on where exactly that line should fall. The practical effects of those guidelines rippled through numerous scripts and story decisions across the series' run, shaping scenes and storylines in ways that were felt by audiences without ever being consciously seen. It was a document most viewers never knew existed, a quiet hand guiding the tone of an imagined future from somewhere firmly in the present. When the series originally aired, it was filmed on 35mm stock capable of capturing far more visual detail than broadcast television could transmit. But the editing and post-production work was completed in standard definition video. When high-definition television became the norm, the show found itself in a position with no simple solution. The remaster project that followed was one of the most ambitious undertakings in television restoration history. Because the finished edited versions existed only in standard definition, every episode had to be rebuilt from the original film negatives. Each scene re-edited frame by frame using the same cuts as the broadcast version, but sourced from elements with dramatically higher resolution. Visual effects that had been composited in video were recreated entirely from scratch, with teams working meticulously to match the original aesthetic while bringing it fully into the high-definition era. Hundreds of effects shots were rebuilt. Thousands of hours were invested. Entire episodes were effectively remade at a technical level, so that future generations could experience them as close to their original vision as modern technology could allow. It was an act of preservation as much as restoration, a recognition that what had been created was genuinely worth the extraordinary effort required to protect it. Star Trek. The next generation didn't arrive polished and fully formed. It was built through conflict, compromise, and a remarkable willingness to take risks that could easily have failed. Spandex uniforms that hurt the people wearing them. A villain that couldn't frighten anyone. A cliffhanger that stopped the country in its tracks. A writer's personal VHS tape that helped restore a classic episode decades after it was made. Behind every season was a production that was, in many ways, making it up as it went along, and somehow getting it profoundly right. The show endures not despite its complicated history, but in many ways because of it. Every compromise, every last-minute swap, every budget crisis and creative argument left its mark on something that became far greater than the sum of its troubled parts. And knowing all of that, the achievement feels not smaller, but considerably larger, a reminder that the most extraordinary things are rarely made under ideal conditions.